Christopher, if you'll yield the screen, then I'd like to put your picture up there. So, thank you. Come on. I'll slide over here.
Yeah, I see
you. Come on. I've got two screens and I can't get you to slide from one screen to the other. Well, excuse me. I thought I was all ready. Now what did I do? Well, I could possibly go without my pictures. How do I get that to close down? That's curious. Well, let me proceed anyway. We have Christopher as our guest this evening. Let me shut my screen share down and let you see him along with the rest of the group. Let me get my glasses on so that I can share what I have prepared. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, participants in the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. Our speaker this evening is Christopher Smith, who comes recommended by a couple of our previous presenters. He has volunteered to introduce us to a Mexican who educated himself about the Book of Mormon enough to give tours to LDS officials and convince them that they were looking at a Book of Mormon or set of Book of Mormon sites. To see through the eyes of Senor Da'valia should be most instructive for us, for he may have been correct, and he may have been in error, but he clearly has played a significant role in interpreting the sites of his land for those who wanted to believe the ties of those sites to the Book of Mormon. Chris sent me the following bio. He has a PhD in religion from Claremont Graduate University, where he had the great privilege of studying under Richard Bushman, who is the masterful author of Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. Christopher has published quite a few academic papers, including 3 or 4 papers on Mormon treasure hunters, slated for publication within the next year. You'll hear about some of that in his presentation this evening to share about some of his forthcoming research. He also blogs about Mormonism at the Worlds Without End blog. He's a regular contributor on the Sunstone Mormon History podcast and is the new books manager at John Whitmer Books. In that capacity, he wanted me to recommend to you and let you know, and I am going to recommend to you, that on February 28th, John Whitmer will be releasing a book entitled Joseph and Lucy Smith's Turnbridge Farm, an Archaeology and Landscape Study. And this, I think, will be the first of a series. I hope it's to be the first of a series to include the Patriarch's house in Nauvoo, which would be that of Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack, their double log house. The Prophet's house in Nauvoo, which will, of course, be the mansion house, which was initially known as the Prophet's house, became the Nauvoo mansion, then became the mansion house. And then we also have possibilities for Samuel Smith home site, the Hiram Smith office, store, or school, which is on Water Street, also in Nauvoo, and the possibilities of some reports coming out of Caldwell County, Missouri. And so if that John Whitmer series becomes available to you, then it appears that the first book is coming out yet this month, and we anticipate the other monographs will be coming out forthwith. Let us pray together. We call upon you, Creator, Heavenly Father, source of light and truth, awesome God, fundament of love, the center point of existence, the great I am. We call upon you, understanding that our poor ability to comprehend eternity limits even our ability to address you. Yet we understand that you are receptive to our positions and the planner of the great cycles embedded by the cycles, the tiny cycles of life. And you are not limited, as are we. This evening we approach a cross-cultural chasm and recognize the inadequacy of our ability to bridge from one to the other. You have told us that you are no respecter of persons. You are our Father, making us sisters and brother. And so we ask you to assist us to respect each other. We can share organs, blood, kidneys, eyes, heart, lungs, and history. And we also share the conundrum of how to address you, our Mother, Father, God, great mystery. And so this evening we ask your blessing on our presenter, Christopher Smith, and all our participants listening, discussing, asking questions forthwith, and pray that our efforts to be appropriate, to bring appropriate gifts, bring them before your face as we seek for commonalities upon which to build up the cause of yours and our Zion place. You sanction our being as we reflect upon yours. You guide us to peace from our traditions of wars. We bow to you in gratitude for your word, the which we have found to be true, and appeal for your blessing, uniting our faith, our desire for love and truth, and to be close to you. Amen. Christopher, floor is yours.
Okay. Let's see if I can get the screen sharing back up.
Oh, there's Earl and there's Pat. Neat. More people in.
Okay, you all can see my screen there?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, this is probably going to be a bit of a different change of pace, judging from the list of other presentation topics, but the title of my presentation is Jose Octavio Da'valia Morales, Archaeology, Tourism, and Treasure Hunting, and the Book of Mormon. So this is really, unless you've heard me talk about this before or served as a peer reviewer for one of my papers, you probably never heard Jose Octavio Da'valia Morales' name. And you probably have no idea who he is. And so if I can convince you by the end of the evening that he is an interesting person and worth learning about, then I will consider that a success. Evidence number one that he is an interesting person and worth learning about is that he hung out with monkeys. Evidence number two, he's ruggedly handsome. Just look at that salt and pepper mustache. That's a beautiful thing. But on a more serious note, evidence number three that he is an interesting person is that he offered the very first commercial tours of the Book of Mormon lands about the year 1955. And his proteges are still giving tours in Mexico and Guatemala to this day. So if you want to tour the Book of Mormon land sites, there's a number of tour agencies out there that are inspired by him and still being conducted. Alma's LDS Tours is one of them. Helleman Book of Mormon Tours is another one. And there are a couple others as well. Da'valia is, I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is Da'valia is a non-white Mormon interpreting the Book of Mormon for white people. And so it's kind of an interesting study on how people's backgrounds and their identities, racial identities, shape how they read the Book of Mormon differently. It's really interesting to think about how the Book of Mormon informed how he thought about his own racial identity, and how he interacted with racial interpretations of the book that were coming out of Salt Lake City in the pre-civil rights era. And secondly, I think that archaeology is an academic discipline practiced by elites. And so when we look at tourism, archaeological tourism, that brings archaeology to the masses by popularizing it and commercializing it. And there are lots of interesting things that happen culturally when archaeology gets popularized like that. It, of course, makes academic research useful to the public to inform people's faith and identities. Religious pilgrimage and tourism have a long history of revitalizing faith. But on the other hand, it brings with it some negative things. It brings with it pseudoscience. It brings with it looting of archaeological sites. And that, of course, generates a backlash from academic elites against the popularizers. And I think all of those tensions and those dynamics are evident in this story. Evidence number 4 that Da'valia is worth learning about is he petted raccoons, I think. I'm getting all my jokes out of the way up front here. Actually, this is probably the Mexican cousin of the raccoon, the coati, and this was just one of the many interesting things that you might have seen on a Jose Da'valia tour. Reason number 5, he carried out his own excavations in search of Book of Mormon artifacts in both Mexico and the United States. He considered himself an archaeologist, and he participated in several important digs with professional archaeologists from BYU. He attended academic conferences with the world's greatest experts on the Maya, so he was pretty well informed. But his critics considered him at best a treasure hunter and at worst a looter. He relied on dreams, visions, and intuition to tell him where to dig. And he did not follow federal regulations governing archaeological digs. And 3 people died in connection with one of his excavations. This slide here shows an excavation in Fillmore, Utah, where he dug for the gold plates of ether, which he believed the Nephite general Moroni had buried there. And that sort of activity garnered a lot of criticism, of course, from academics at BYU. And in fact, I think it's partly by distancing itself from Da'valia and people like him that Book of Mormon archaeology kind of defined itself as a professional discipline. So having said all of that by way of introduction, hopefully your interest is piqued. And so I'm going to kind of take his life from the top now. Da'valia was born in 1925 in Tampico, Mexico. He was a mestizo, meaning mixed blood Huautez Mayan Indian, so of Mayan descent. He was raised a Spanish speaker, but he started learning English when he was 8 years old and visited the US at 15. And when he was 20, he took a job as a Mexican federal tour guide, giving tours of archaeological sites to gringos. And the following year, he gave a tour to a Mormon widow from Bountiful, Utah. He fell in love with her, married her, and they settled in the town of Puebla in Mexico. Her name was Hazel, and she was almost twice his age when she married her. And in fact, they fudged her age a little bit in the wedding announcements to make the age gap seem less extreme. He also fell in love with her religion, and he joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints the year that he married her. And he became a district counselor in the Mexican mission and a branch president in Puebla. And he joined the church because he was passionate about Mayan history. And he believed that the Book of Mormon could inform his study of Mayan history. He had no formal archaeological training, but he was a voracious reader with a photographic memory and, of course, working as a federal tour guide in archaeological sites. And he was an early adherent of what is called the limited geography theory, which I presume you guys have heard about in your group. That's the hypothesis that the events described in the Book of Mormon mostly occurred in a limited region in Central America, mostly in Mexico, Guatemala, maybe Honduras and El Salvador. This theory is often attributed to John Sorensen, whose 1985 book is considered the definitive treatment of this theory. He's a BYU archaeologist. But actually, versions of this theory had existed for about a century by the time Sorensen published on it. And in the 1950s, when Sorensen was a graduate student, BYU's University Archaeological Society and New World Archaeology Foundation were just beginning to turn this limited geography theory into a scientific framework and to conduct some archaeological excavations in Central America in the effort to prove this theory. John Sorensen participated in some of those very first BYU excavations in Mexico and Guatemala. And guess who else participated in those excavations? Our guy, Jose Da'valia. Da'valia joined the University Archaeology Society, and he fully embraced this limited geography theory. He got to know a guy named Maxwell Jakeman, who is often referred to as the father of Book of Mormon archaeology. And when Jakeman in 1954 organized an expedition to identify likely Book of Mormon sites in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, he hired Jose Da'valia to serve as a guide for the BYU archaeologists. And they spent most of their time in a dugout canoe exploring the Usumacinta River in Guatemala. Jakeman believed that the Usumacinta was the Book of Mormon's River Sidon. And along the river, they discovered ruins, now known as the El Cayo Archaeological Zone, which Jakeman believed were the ruins of Zarahemla. And 2 years later, Da'valia participated in the excavation of this site. And he, in his own words, said, "I know the site has all the geographical requirements given for Zarahemla in the Book of Mormon. We found the wall, the temple, pre-classic pottery, and the hills Amnihu and Manti." He also served as a guide for General Authority Milton R. Hunter of the First Council of the 70. Da'valia and Hunter took 3 trips together in 1954 and 1955. This is a photo of them together on their expedition. Hunter was a Book of Mormon archaeology enthusiast, not a trained archaeologist, but an interested amateur. And he wrote an entire book about his adventures with Da'valia on these trips, titled Archaeology and the Book of Mormon. And it's sometimes hard to tell which of the ideas in this book are Hunter's own ideas and which ideas he got from Da'valia, but quite a bit of this seems to have been Da'valia's ideas that he conveyed to Hunter and that Hunter then recorded in the book. For instance, in 1954, they started their trip at Chichen Itza. And in the Temple of the Wall panels there, Da'valia showed Hunter this relief of a man standing beside a waist-high animal that Da'valia called a clear representation of a horse. Hunter became highly excited because the Book of Mormon mentions the Nephites riding horses, but the archaeological consensus was and is that there were no horses in the Americas before Christopher Columbus arrived. And this was a long-standing problem for believers in Book of Mormon historicity. And so this seemed like clear evidence of the Book of Mormon. It may have been a dog or a deer. Some other identifications have been suggested for that animal. Da'valia also recorded for Hunter, or recounted for Hunter, a story from an early Spanish chronicle about 3 white-skinned immortal holy men who had ruled Chichen Itza from the 8th to 10th centuries. So for several centuries, they ruled, and they ruled well, but then when human sacrifice was introduced to the peninsula, they disappeared and no one had heard from them since. And Hunter concluded from this story that the 3 brothers might have been the 3 Nephites of the Book of Mormon. This is actually a super distorted version of the story. In the original Spanish chronicle, the 3 brothers were not white men, and they also were not immortal. And their rule was kind of mixed, somewhat good, somewhat bad, and they were eventually killed in a popular uprising. Da'valia and Hunter both had a tendency to kind of bend the facts a bit to their interpretations rather than the other way around. On his second trip with Da'valia in December 1954, shown in the photograph here, you can see Da'valia on the far left of that photograph and Hunter standing right behind him. Hunter invited 20 other people for a tour of ancient America and Book of Mormon lands. And as far as I can tell, this was the first commercial tour of Book of Mormon lands. And it was so successful that Da'valia then went on to build an entire business around offering Book of Mormon lands tours to Utah Mormons. This was the beginning of that industry that still exists today. This tour group flew into Guatemala City, and they studied the local Quiche Maya people there. Hunter believed that the Quiche Maya were perhaps the most direct descendants of the Nephite Lamanite peoples. And so they spent, Hunter says, "We spent our time observing whether or not the Indians possessed Jewish characteristics. all the members of our party were of the opinion that they did. And those Jewish characteristics that they noticed included both physical features and social features. So for instance, as they wandered through a Guatemala City market that sold native handicrafts, Hunter and his party felt that we had been transported into the old world and that the ancient customs transported from Jerusalem by the Nephites had survived in Guatemala. And one evidence of that was that they noticed that local native dress included a peculiar apron that reminded Hunter of the temple garment. And the villagers told him that they wore that apron by ancient sacred custom, and they showed him a stone figurine that appeared to be a pre-Columbian figurine of a person wearing that apron. Hunter found the Quiche Maya intelligent and industrious, good-looking, appealing, and not inclined to steal. And he speculated that because of their intermarriage taboos, the Quiche had retained the purity of their blood and thus were more closely related to the Nephites than the Lamanites. And this was definitely a time in Mormon history where positive moral characteristics were associated with white blood. And so, Hunter is sort of rationalizing a little bit why these native people are seen to be smart and hardworking. His party photographed Indian after Indian who we thought were definitely Hebraic-like. Da'valia, by the way, considered himself a Nephite rather than a Lamanite, which I think is why some of this racial rhetoric didn't bother him, because he identified more with kind of the white racial identity of the Book of Mormon rather than the dark. Most of the tour group returned to the United States on January 6th, but Hunter stayed behind and went on another expedition with Da'valia for 3 weeks. They visited Copan, where they saw a Hebraic-like representation of a bearded man on a vase. And they visited Tikal, where they saw ancient cement buildings and recalled that the Book of Mormon historians claim that the Nephites became experts in the use of cement. They also visited the Temple of the Murals at Bonampak in Chiapas, Mexico. This is very near to the site that Jakeman identified as the location of Zarahemla. They wanted to see the Maya murals of white and dark peoples painted on the temple walls. And so they flew as close to the site as they could, and they landed on a small airstrip and then hiked into the jungle to reach the site. And on the way, they met 3 Lacandan Indians. These are indigenous people who still worship today at this temple. And the Lacandan Indians agreed to guide Hunter and Da'valia to the temple site. And Hunter noted with surprise that the skin of one of the Lacandan women was very white, just as white as the skin of our women. The other 2 Lacandans had merely a tinge of color in their skins, they also being practically white. And here is a page from Hunter's book, and the woman on the far right has red hair. Hunter says one of the women actually had red hair and her skin was just as white as ours. Hunter and Da'valia hiked into the temple, and Hunter was a bit of a wuss during the hike, and the Lacandan guides repeatedly tried to leave him behind. It was a 32-mile hike, but he said he thought there had been a decimal point misplaced, and it was actually 320 miles, although they made it in a couple days, so I don't think it could have been 320 miles. At the temple, Hunter and Da'valia found murals depicting people with different skin tones. And so you can see in this mural, especially on that bottom row there, some of the people have darker skin than others. There's actually like 3 different skin tones depicted on these walls. And Hunter is very interested in this. He finds it as evidence of the Book of Mormon. And he uses a lot of very racially stereotyped language when talking about all of this, which I won't go into in detail, but if you're interested, you can read the book. As Da'valia participated in all of these different expeditions with BYU archaeologists and with Milton R. Hunter, he formulated his own theories of Book of Mormon geography. And so it's kind of hard to see. This is a drawing that he made of his views of Book of Mormon geography. But in the upper left-hand corner is a an arrow that says Mulex Landing Place on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And then down at the bottom of the image is another arrow that says it's Lehi's Landing Place. And that is on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. And those were two of the locations that Da'valia proposed. He used Jakeman's Zarahemla site as his starting point, and he built his geography around that. And honestly, a lot of the identifications that he made were based on a kind of free association. So for instance, the reason he picked that site as Lehi's landing site was that that's the mouth of the river Nahualate, and Nahualate means on the other side of the waters. And so Da'valia thought that this might be a linguistic survival from the Book of Mormon era, and that basically the name was, that the river was given that name because Lehi had landed there. He, in order to prove his theories, conducted excavations and expeditions, and one of the expeditions that he conducted was to find the remains of Lehi's boat along this river. I think he failed to find the boat, but he saw in a dream that it was at the bottom of the sea. At least that's what I was told by someone who knew him. Da'valia also correlated the Book of Mormon with Mayan texts. So there's a text called the Title of the Lords of Totonicapán, written in the Quiche language in the 16th century. So during the colonial era, this is after the Spanish have arrived and colonized the Americas. And according to this text, the Mayans were first, they descended from the lost tribes of Israel, and they had emigrated to the Americas from a mythical city called Tulan, located in Assyria. Drawing on clues from the Title of the Lords of Totonicapán and from the Book of Mormon, Da'valia created his own Book of Mormon geography. And so you can see some of the sites that he identified here. He concluded that Totonicapán was the Book of Mormon city Shemlon, that Bountiful was the ruins at Palenque, which include iconography of the cross. They also include a tower that he compared to the Tower of Benjamin, and they include a tomb that's in the shape of the Christian ichthys symbol, which is the that fish-shaped symbol that people put on their bumpers. There's a tomb in that shape. And there's also a relief there that he interpreted as a depiction of Cain's murder of Abel. The Hill Cumorah he identified with Cerro Alto in the Mexican state of Veracruz. And a journalist recorded his reasoning for choosing that site. The journalist says, "In this area have been found many huge breastplates and other relics of ancient warfare. Archaeologists have determined those to be left from early encounters between the Indians and the Spanish conquerors of Mexico. Da'valia, however, believes they are the relics of the last Lamanite-Nephite battle." So as you know, probably, I assume you know, there's a controversy over the Hill Cumorah because, of course, the Hill Cumorah is in New York State, according to old Mormon tradition, but that doesn't fit with the limited geography. And so it has been proposed that there are actually two Hill Cumorahs, one in Mexico and one in upstate New York. And Da'valia's explanation for how Moroni got the golden plates from Cerro Alto to the hill in upstate New York is Moroni was a hunted man fleeing for his life. He ran not back into the lands of the Lamanites, his hunters to the south, but northward. He ran for 11 years. His flight for life took him to what is now upstate New York. He traveled farther in the 11 years than the descendants of Lehi did in the hundreds of years they were in America. Moroni was a lone man running from danger, Da'valia explains, while his ancestors were an entire race building up a civilization and a culture, the remnants of which can still be found. Although Da'valia was not an archaeologist and was not actually legally authorized to be digging for artifacts, he did quite a bit of digging in order to prove these theories. For instance, in 1959, he recruited a couple of recently released Mormon missionaries, and he took them to dig near Nahuala, his proposed site for the city of Nephi in Guatemala, down there in the lower right corner. He dug into two of the mounds, and he found what he believed were the remains of Nephi's tomb and temple. He and the missionaries, however, had to flee the site due to lack of proper permission to excavate, but not before they looted some ceramics from the mounds. On one of the ceramic vessels he uncovered was painted a figure which he interpreted as the prophet Nephi. He showed the items to an expert in archaeology who dated them to 600 BCE. And then he donated the looted artifacts to the New World Archaeology Foundation, which was affiliated with BYU. By the way, folks, please don't loot archaeological sites in search of proof of the Book of Mormon. It's not classy. There was a brief moment, therefore, in the 1950s when Da'valia was accepted as part of Book of Mormon archaeology, when the discipline was just beginning to take off. But it was only about a 3-year window. And after that, Da'valia was kind of on the outside. He conducted all of his digs and tours independently after that 3-year window. So what happened? Why did he sort of get pushed out? Well, for one thing, I think the BYU archaeologists got more comfortable navigating Mexico and Guatemala on their own, and they probably had less need for guides like Da'valia. And also Da'valia was kind of an independent spirit, so I don't know that he would have, stayed under the auspices of BYU anyway. I think he was always sort of inclined to be an entrepreneur and strike out on his own. But for another thing, Book of Mormon archaeology was trying to become more professional, more respectable, and frankly, more secular during this period. And as part of that process, it was pushing out religiously motivated amateurs like Da'valia and also Milton R. Hunter. So BYU's New World Archaeology Foundation was founded in 1952, and it fast became a source of embarrassment to certain church leaders, partly because some of them perceived its work as unscholarly, and to others because the limited geography theory was perceived as unorthodox. Particularly Marion G. Romney and Joseph Fielding Smith were firmly committed to the view that Book of Mormon events had happened in the entire Americas, North and South America, and that the Hill Cumorah was located in New York, not in Mexico, among other things. They told Milton R. Hunter that the limited geography was heresy and that they would never read his book. So that was kind of the conservative backlash against Book of Mormon archaeology. And then the more progressively minded church leaders wanted the church to do archaeology and BYU to do archaeology in a more secular way, because they felt that if evidence of the Book of Mormon were to come from archaeology, it would be better really if it came from non-Mormons. They worried that any evidence of the Book of Mormon might sort of be tainted if it were discovered by church archaeologists. And then internally at BYU, some of the archaeologists were quite happy to secularize their work. They saw religious agendas as an obstacle to good science. And as an example of this, there was a graduate student in the archaeology department named Clark S. Knowlton. And in 1954, he wrote to Ross T. Christensen that he was amused by the account in the Church News of Hunter's views of the Book of Mormon ruins. This was an article about Hunter's trip to Mexico with Da'valia. And Knowlton says, he is the type that can and has done considerable harm to Book of Mormon archaeological studies. I would like to vote against him sometime in church if one could vote on each general officer. So I think that gives you an illustration of how quickly the professional archaeologists at BYU were kind of souring on religiously motivated archaeology and on involvement by amateurs like Hunter and Da'valia. And by 1961, the archaeologists at BYU were being forbidden by church leaders to make any correlation between the Book of Mormon and archaeological sites. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Da'valia directed his efforts toward a popular audience. He gave tours and lectures to Mormon laypeople throughout Utah. And in fact, he moved to Utah for a while and founded an organization called the Moroni Archaeological Society, which was funded and staffed by Mormon laypeople who he had recruited from various wards in Utah. There were about 100 lay Mormon volunteers who helped him in his archaeological excavations to hunt for gold plates buried by the Nephite general Moroni in a canyon near Fillmore, Utah. a farmer named Del Allgood had brought to Da'vala's attention some petroglyphs that were up the canyon. And you can see here a photograph of those petroglyphs that had been chalked in so that they're a little bit more visible. And Da'vala used a document from the 19th century called the Egyptian Alphabet and Grammar that was created by Joseph Smith. And he also used a scholarly lexicon of Egyptian hieroglyphics in order to produce a translation of these petroglyphs. Basically, what he was doing was taking these symbols and breaking them down in various ways into sort of sub-symbols. And he continued doing that until he found some combination that gave him a meaningful translation. And then when he was done, he basically had translated a treasure map that pointed to the burying place of some golden plates. The inscription was signed by the angel Moroni, he believed, and he believed that the plates were the plates of ether. And he spent several years and several $1,000s digging in the area. Eventually, there was a dispute over the mining claim because he was not actually the owner of the mining claim. And when the sheriffs ordered him and his volunteers off that site, his volunteers wanted to make one last big push in order to find the plates. And so they used a ton of dynamite down there, and they released a bunch of carbon monoxide gas and did not allow enough time for it to clear. And a couple of his volunteers died in a mining accident, killed by the carbon monoxide gas. And obviously that threw the whole operation and Da'vala's reputation much into disrepute. He also damaged his reputation by promoting these cute little gold plates called the Padilla plates. They were discovered by a guy named Jesus Padilla in Mexico, and Da'vala had gotten them from Jesus Padilla. A BYU archaeologist named Ray Matheny wrote a report that declared these plates to be a forgery and presented a lot of evidence for that. And the Deseret News, partly I think on information provided by this BYU archaeologist Ray Matheny, published an op-ed that not only denounced these plates as a forgery, but also really went after Da'vala with kind of character attacks, character assassinations. And by 1970, Da'vala kind of left the United States. He was bankrupt from his excavations and he was disgraced. And in 1971, he was arrested by the Mexican government on suspicion of international artifact smuggling, specifically for bringing these golden Padilla plates across the border into the United States. Assuming that these were a real artifact, it was illegal for him to bring them into the United States. Those charges got dropped partly because a friend of Da'vala named J. Golden Barton smuggled these plates out of his residence so that the police wouldn't find them. And then J. Golden Barton brought those plates back into the United States again. So repeating the offense of international artifact smuggling there. But Da'vala did a few years in prison anyway for driving unregistered vehicles. I think the Mexican government knew that he had done this. And so even though they couldn't find evidence of the crime he was charged of, they kind of pulled an Al Capone and got him on another charge that was unrelated. After his release from prison, Da'vala returned to work as a tour guide in Cancun. And in the summer of 1978, he met a Mormon professor of public health named Jerry L. Ainsworth. Ainsworth became a disciple of Da'vala, visited him every summer for many years, and accompanied him on many expeditions, including an expedition to the hill that Da'vala believed was the Hill Cumorah. And Ainsworth wrote a book called The Lives and Travels of Mormon and Moroni, which is almost entirely based on Da'vala's views of Book of Mormon geography. And this book is still popular in some conservative Mormon circles, particularly among people who like to go hunt for Nephite and Jaredite artifacts. And so there's lots more that I could say about Da'vala. I'm running short on time here, so I will just wrap it up by saying there's basically three groups today that are still influenced by Da'vala and kind of carry on his legacy. One of those is Jerry Ainsworth and the readers of his book, so the people associated with that circle. There's a group of tour guides who learned from Da'vala and continue to offer tours to Mormon people in Central America, tours of the Book of Mormon lands. And then the third group is called the Ancient Historical Research Foundation. It's associated with a guy named Terry Carter, who lives in Utah. And he got interested in what he calls the mystery glyphs. So the petroglyphs that Da'valia translated in Fillmore are one of a set of a dozen or so different sets of glyphs that appear all over the southwestern United States and have kind of similar shapes. They tend to be like a mix of esoteric symbols from all over the world. And Terry Carter got really interested in those glyphs, which date back, 100 years or so at least, and wanted to find out what was going on with those. And he greatly investigated the Da'valia story, got to know Jose, and Terry Carter actually has Da'valia's papers and journals and things. And he and his group, the Ancient Historical Research Foundation, continue to carry on Da'valia's work of hunting for Nephite and Jaredite artifacts in Utah specifically. So they're more in kind of the treasure hunting tradition. And with that, I think I will conclude. And if you all have questions, then I will go ahead and take your questions.
Thank you, Christopher. I would like to begin the questioning, if I may. I'm not sure though that I'm live with you. You verify for me?
Yes.
Okay. You showed the picture of the tour, first tour, 1954, and they were at Teotihuacan in front of the Temple of the Sun.
Uh-huh.
I'm curious, what interpretation did Da'valia provide for that great site that dated back to the time of Christ?
Yeah, so I don't have a record of how he interpreted that on that trip. I do have an extended narrative of one of his tours. So if I pull up some of my research on that, I may be able to find an answer for you, but I don't know off the top of my head.
I'm interested that he had Bountiful and Zarahemla identified, and Teotihuacan, of course, also has the cement, and
Right.
that therefore could offer some competition in terms of his own interpretation.
Yeah, I think that when it came to Aztec sites like Teotihuacan, he was less inclined to connect those directly to the Book of Mormon. He was more making sort of general connections with like their understanding of astrology, having connections to Israelite concepts of astrology, their traditions of human sacrifice. He was connecting to Book of Mormon, Jewish sacrifice traditions, and the use of cement and things like that. He was connecting to the Book of Mormon, but in a more general way than with the Mayan sites. He really saw the Mayans as being the Nephites, and the Aztecs were, more Lamanites and kind of later. You mentioned Ray Matheny, and I had the privilege of working with Ray back in 1980 when he brought his crew from Adamandiaman to Nauvoo, and then we went to visit him at Adamandiaman. And then 2 years ago, he and his wife came to Nauvoo as our special guest to present at our symposium. And just a remarkable life story, just a remarkable person, and to see that he went on to his next reward, his next project just a few months ago. Was a sad commentary, but he lived a very rich and full life. Yeah, it's unfortunate that he has passed on. I would love to have interviewed him for this paper. One of his students told me that Ray often said in his classes that he felt like a modern Charles Anthon because people would bring in everything from metal plates to Mayan codices for his opinion on them. And he was kind of the go-to guy at BYU for kind of debunking weird artifacts. And so he got to see all the forgeries as well as a lot of authentic things. And he could be quite brutal in his debunkings when he thought that something wasn't real. And he actually got in trouble, I think, once or twice for coming across as maybe too skeptical about, some of the claims that people were making about the Book of Mormon. So he had to kind of tone it down, I think, toward the end of his life in his comments on the Book of Mormon.
He clearly devoted himself to his archaeology and gave his science preference to his religious background.
Very much, yeah. There was another guy at BYU named Paul Chessman, and Paul was much more inclined. In fact, Paul believed in the Padilla plates. He believed that the Padilla plates were an authentic artifact. And so there was a lot of back and forth between Paul and Ray about all of these sorts of artifacts. They were often debating the authenticity of artifacts like this.
Well, having known him, I remember being quite astounded to hear on NPR some 20 years ago that he was being celebrated because he had been reunited with the one of the other people that had been on the airplane that got shot down over France during World War II.
Oh,
He spent 18 months then in the Nazi prison camp. Was there to march out with the Jewish survivors, and had tremendous testimony of just the really horrible situation of that war. But he was navigator for the bomber, and they got shot down. He either bailed out or somehow got out and woke up sailing through the air, got his parachute open and crash landed through the ice of a canal, and then it was picked up by the Nazis shortly thereafter. So,
wow, that's a wild story.
And he published that account. I have given my copy of that to my grandson because I thought it needed to be passed on. But
Yeah.
Ray Matheny, you can look up his book because it's a tremendous survival story, and the fact that he had been able to survive that kind of thing made it so that he was able to do all kinds of unexpected things as an archaeologist, including
Wow.
the investigations of El Mirador, where
Yeah.
he had a wheel come off of his airplane, and so he had Mexicans fabricate a wheel out of wood, and he was able to use that to fly out. So fascinating stories. Anyway, yeah, sorry, it got me distracted here because he's such a fine guy.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Ray also dug at Adamonte in Missouri, and he claimed that his report was sealed by the first presidency.
Well, his report, yeah, that's a site that I got to visit him on, and his report showed that the altar that the church had been claiming was the altar of Adam, was actually late woodland, dated only about 1,000 years, and there weren't any other artifactual evidences to support the earlier occupation either, and so he was fundamentally debunking the whole Garden of Eden story for the church.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an illustration of, how skeptical he could be and how distasteful he could be to some of the more conservatively inclined members of the hierarchy.
That's right. He did indicate that he thought his survival as an archaeologist at BYU was special because one of the prophetic leaders had told him that you go do the science and we'll cover you back here. And so since he had one, I don't recall who the prophet was that gave him that permission, but it allowed him then to go ahead and pursue his science and not worry about his religious faith.
Very interesting.
Back to Da'valia. Other people, I should be able to get the screen open here again. I somehow lost my access to the gallery. But
Of the PowerPoint? Is that what you're trying to get to?
I was trying to get to the gallery so that I could see all the people.
Oh.
And for some
You're a
reason,
glutton for punishment. He wants to see all of our faces.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys don't get good grades unless you ask good questions, and I want to catch you doing that.
I'd love to share my knowledge with you, but I don't have any.
It is as I said when we started, I think it's probably a very different topic from a lot of the other ones that you've heard. I hope it was of interest.
Oh, yeah, I really appreciate it. I didn't need to say.
When I was in Graceland a few years ago, back in the 60s, we had a Book of Mormon class that met quite a bit. I don't remember if Sterling Barlow was in that group or not, but Delbert Smith was the chaplain at Graceland at that time. And someone came in with a group of maps on the central part of Mexico, the area you were talking about, depicting where the cities were. And it's around my house somewhere, but I can't find them. But I thought that very interesting that you showed that particular map.
Yeah, there have been a number of different proposals, and I think that Jakeman's proposal for the site of Zarahemla is no longer in fashion. I don't think that John Sorensen and those who are associated with John Sorensen accept that site for Zarahemla. So this is certainly, a dated conception of Book of Mormon geography, but it's an interesting one, I think.
Well, this is Nancy Sherman, and my mom studied a lot of the Mayan with Linda Sheely for many years. And the one thing she realized pretty quickly was that most of the Mayan glyphs are talking about bloodletting and blood, all kinds of blood things like that, and about the kings and the wars, and they really don't have anything to do with things that we would be interested in. They're more pretty bloody stuff, in other words.
Yeah, and it's worth keeping in mind that Mayan glyphs were fairly recently decoded.
Yes.
And in fact, at the time that Da'valia was attending all of these Mayan symposia, people were still trying to figure out how to read the Mayan glyphs.
And they're very good at it now.
Yeah, right. So he was operating in an information vacuum.
Right. Yeah.
So, I think that you have to give him a little bit of credit for putting in the work at least.
You work with what you've got.
Yep. I think JM Clee is trying to talk, but it looks like you're muted.
How about that?
There you go.
That's better. I'm still trying to get an A in your class, Paul. And I do have a question. I don't think it's probably a really good one, but I'm just curious. Now, if somebody digs up a lot of these artifacts and just takes them in someplace, do they have a carbon dating now that will tell them what date they are? And you don't have a person just saying this came from so-and-so at such time?
It depends what kind of artifact it is. So carbon dating only works on organic materials. So tree bark, grains, stuff like that, you can carbon date. Skins, animal skins, you can carbon date, but you can't carbon date stone or ceramics. There are other techniques for dating ceramics. They can look at like the glaze that was used and sometimes figure out based on that. They can look at, where is the object located in layers of dirt, and if they can date the dirt, then they can date the object. So they have techniques for other things, but the carbon dating, it's a wonderful tool, but unfortunately it's pretty limited in terms of what it can tell you about rocks and ceramics and arrowheads and stuff like that.
Thank you. I learned a lot tonight. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, good. I'm glad.
Let me address that too, if I may, Joetta. The fact that a carbon is only one of the dating strategies makes it clearly appropriate if you can find the carbon in situ and be able to get a good on the soiled sample.
Yeah.
But there's, many of the ceramic, most of the ceramics
You don't
can
have to
be
walk through here.
identified in terms of their the nature of the construction, to be able to know approximately what date. And the projectile points also are classified, so we get pretty good dates on those. And so as you're looking at cultural material, the experienced archaeologists will be able to give you reasonably good estimates. But the terrible thing is that so many of these things that you're talking about have been pirated out of sight, out of the site, sometimes out of the country, illegally. And the pot hunters have found good international markets, and those have really displaced an awful lot of tremendously valuable cultural material. And so Christopher's note that we don't go pot hunting and digging for artifacts to take them out of the place is well taken, and it's really important. Well, even on what we're doing at Nauvoo, the artifacts tell the truth, and you need to be able to see them in their context in order to get more of that story. And so to allow them to be dug up and pilfered away and sold means that you lose a tremendous amount of information.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, because there's multiple dating techniques, you can use all the dating techniques to confirm each other if you have it in context and you properly document your excavation. But you're exactly right. I mean, can you imagine if the proverbial sign to Zarahemla actually was found, but it was found by a pot hunter and removed from its context, and therefore you lose, that as a potential evidence to confirm the Book of Mormon, because you don't have any of the context and you don't have the provenance, and so it just gets dismissed as a forgery because it turned up in some artifact market somewhere.
Ron has a question.
Yeah. Well, I appreciated your report. I've spent most of my life under the understanding that the Book of Mormon was limited to Montepec geography. That is Vernile Simmons in her book People, Places, and Prophecies identifies the Usumacinta as Riverside and not Bonampak, but one Yastilan as one of the major sites there, which is of course close to Bonampak, and there's a slightly different hill, but the other Camorra Hill in Mexico, and so anyway, I find it very interesting. I don't know if there was any connection in terms of where Vernile started or not, but I just found it very interesting that
Vernile probably was informed by Jakeman. Jakeman was kind of the founder of Book of Mormon Archaeology, and he's the one who made that initial identification of the Usumacinta as the River Sidon. And Da'valia just followed him in identifying that river. So probably Jakeman was the source for Vernile.
Chris, this is Sterling Barlow.
Hi.
Hi, I appreciated your presentation. I think most of us are here because we are attached to the Book of Mormon, to the things that are taught there and to the messages that are in it. Mm-hmm. But let's take a contrarian viewpoint. Mm-hmm. Let's assume that one of us here believes the Book of Mormon is entirely fictional. Is there anything that you have encountered by way of actual physical evidence that is identifiable from the book itself and is associated with an archaeological site to the point that someone who is a is not of the belief that the Book of Mormon represents real history would actually come to accept that as a proof of something in the Book of Mormon being real?
I mean, the answer is no, but also the answer is that I'm not an archaeologist. And while I have made, pretty extensive study of kind of Mormon folk culture in the 20th century, I definitely haven't made the study of like Mayan archaeological sites that would allow me to answer that question. So I probably am the wrong person to ask that question to be honest.
Well, we've got to assume that there are several people out there who are doing that research. So thank you very much.
Yep, there's quite a few working on it.
Well, I've always told people that whether they believe in the book or not, it's a good read. So,
Yeah, definitely.
Frank has a question.
Yeah,